Okay. So again, there are a few names on the list for dedication. If somebody wouldn't mind, we've got it on the screen here, so thanks. I will be pulling up the prayers in just a moment. Stella, were you okay with leading the prayers? Okay, so Stella's going to lead the prayers tonight with Jana at home. So thanks, Stella. Let me go ahead and put those on the screen for everyone.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times in English. To the founder,
The endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
offering in English. This ground,
Anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami.
Shita, once in English and twice in Tibetan. I
Go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Chodam Soke Chokdam Chanchu Bardu Dakni Kyapsu Chi Daki Chulyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Penche Sangye Dupar Sho Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam Jamchu Bardu Dakni Kyapsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi Dola Benche Sangye Drupa Sho. Thank you, Stella. Thank you, everyone. Let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. Give us a chance to just focus the mind a bit using the breath for the first few minutes, and then we'll set our motivation together. So again, whatever technique you prefer to use with the breath, you're welcome to use that for these first few minutes in silence. And then, as I said, I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation of bodhicitta for tonight. So I'll ring the bell here to begin the meditation. But now, to set our motivation for tonight's class, I'm going to invite you to briefly reflect on the role that anger has played in your own life. This is the subject we're going to be looking at for these 4 sessions in April. But it is important, as painful as it can be, for us to look at how anger arises in our own minds. And as we'll be discussing, there's kind of a whole range of emotions that we can include in here, everything from minor annoyance or irritation all the way up to full-blown rage. So just take a minute or two to examine which types of anger play out in your own mind. Recall some of those experiences that you've had with anger, what occurred, and begin to generate a wish to address this negative emotion, seeing how dangerous, how destructive it can be. So just spend a minute or two in silence, reflecting on your own experience with this volatile emotion of anger. As we reflect on anger in our lives, no doubt we can very easily see what harm it does to ourselves. And it disturbs our own minds, our own peace. But moreover, we can see the harm that we do to others frequently through our anger, the words we use, the actions we engage in response to their harm or things they do that upset us. So we're going to generate a motivation that includes both self and others, as usual. We're here always with that initial thought of needing to work on ourselves, to diminish this mind of anger from the perspective of helping us to have greater patience, greater tolerance, peace of mind in the face of whatever life presents us. We also want to hold that motivation that is concerned about the welfare of others, seeing the harm that we do to others through that mind of anger. And moreover, how this is something we want to address within our world. And as we often say, the change we want to see in the world starts with ourselves. So we're here with that bigger motivation of wanting to address our anger so we can be of greater use and benefit to others, not harming them through our thoughts, actions, words, but moreover, taming our own minds so we can help others to do the same. So generate that motivation for being here. It encompasses all beings as the object of these thoughts of wanting to benefit them and not wanting to harm them. We can open our eyes fully and we'll begin the class. So again, this is a course that I've done a number of times. I did it here at least once, or for this group at least once. I don't know if it was during the pandemic when it was online, I can't recall, but I've structured it a little bit differently. And we've got 4 sessions to go over the material. We'll see how much of it I'm able to cover, but I was able to do a weekend at the Santa Fe Center down the road last year, where I covered everything in 2 Saturdays. So I think I'll do okay here. But so again, anger is one of the most destructive emotions that we have, and it's really good to develop skills around it, particularly looking at the world we live in, right? There's never a shortage of things to annoy us, to irritate us, to cause us to get our minds upset. I'm going to share with you some verses from Master Shantideva's text. I'll be quoting from Master Shantideva a number of times throughout this. Most of you are familiar with the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. The chapter I'm going to be quoting from is chapter 5, actually. Chapter 6 is the one that's on patience, which I'll be quoting from quite a bit because there's wonderful advice there about how we cultivate the mind of patience and overcome our anger. But in chapter 5, Master Shantideva goes into how all 6 of the Bodhisattva perfections, patience being the 3rd perfection of the 6, how they're all mental development. They're not changing the outside world. And so it's kind of interesting when you think about Master Shantideva living in the 8th century in India in a monastery, and yet he had an ability to, oops, I'm sorry, this isn't what I wanted to share. I wanted to share the slides. He had an ability to really know exactly what was going on in terms of things that beings like ourselves had to encounter. He himself lived in a life somewhat similar to Buddha Shakyamuni, a princely life, and then eventually abandoned that to go study at the monastery. So it's on the screen, yes, the slides? Okay. So this is the verses from Master Shantideva that I wanted to share on this topic. He says, unruly beings are as unlimited as space. They cannot possibly all be overcome. But if I overcome thoughts of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all foes. So he's pointing once again to the supremacy of the mind. On the external environment, you may have lots of foes, enemies, difficult people arising. But if we overcome our own thoughts of anger, then we vanquished all those foes. Then he uses this wonderful example. He says, where would I possibly find enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth? There's a lot of sharp objects out there, right? Here in the deserts of New Mexico, we see, you couldn't walk barefoot for very far without piercing the bottom of your feet with all kinds of sharp objects, right? He says, but wearing leather just on the soles of my shoes is equivalent to covering the earth with it. So you might think, well, it'd be nice to cover the whole earth and make it all smooth and wonderful. But isn't it better just to cover your own feet? Then you can go wherever you want and you don't have to worry about who's annoying, who's difficult, what's happening around you. So then the final verse in this little series dealing with patience. Likewise, it is not possible for me to restrain the external course of things. But should I restrain this mind of mine, what would be the need to restrain all else? So we really do see that it all comes down to our minds, and we're going to talk about mind a little bit. I talked about it last week in the one-off I did on developing the peaceful heart, so I won't go into as much detail on mind. But for this course, I have put together the way I'm doing it now. I'm not going to use slides so much. There's a few slides that I will go to, but I have 3 handouts, and the link to these will come out with next week's email. But I'm making those all available to you. The first handout is the course outline. Let me go ahead and show you that. It's essentially going into just a single page, the various topics that we're going to cover. And you'll notice that there's quite a few topics, but again, we'll see how far we get into each of these over the course of the 4 sessions. Tonight, I'm hoping to actually cover pretty much everything that's on the screen. The very first introduction to this topic, investigating anger and patience, just to get our heads around those topics. And then begin to look at the techniques to practice patience. And the first level of practice that we'll get into hopefully tonight, at least one of those points, if not all 3 of those points that are under there. I also have put together a number of kind of practices that you can do that are lined up with. You'll see back on the outline, practice number 1 has to do with kind of how anger is arising. We can begin to deconstruct that a little bit. We're going to talk about that shortly. And then practice 2 and 3 and so on, they continue through the rest of this sheet. So you have a number of practices that you can work with. My advice will always be just to work with what you feel is addressing your working with anger over the course of the week. And then certainly you have all these to draw from going forward, techniques that you can use in the future. All right. Then there are readings that I put together. This is the longer document, and I do have some of these I'm going to be looking at tonight and sharing some quotes from. But these are different passages. Probably a good share of them are coming from the book that's quoted on the front there, which is the wonderful book by Venerable Thupten Chodron. It's called Working with Anger. This is the older version of it. It's just been republished with a different cover. It's got the same title, fortunately. Sometimes they republish books with different titles, but it's the same book. But this is a wonderful book to go into more detail on this. I'm not covering everything in here, and I am covering some things that aren't in here, but nonetheless, it's a wonderful resource if you do find that you need additional support after this course. So again, what we're going to look at tonight is initially just to investigate what we mean by anger, what we mean by patience, these two states of mind. So let's go ahead and start with a few of the readings that I've highlighted there. Um, so I don't know how visible the highlight is in the Gompa here. Can you tell that it's maybe? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and read this little passage and then talk about it a bit. In Buddhism, she says, this is Venerable Children, anger is a mental factor that, being unable to bear a person, object, situation, or idea, harbors ill will towards it or wishes to harm it. Anger covers a range of emotions. This is what I mentioned in the meditation, right? Including annoyance, irritation, frustration, spite, belligerence, resentment, hatred, and rage. Although the English word anger may very occasionally be used in a positive sense, here, as one of the root disturbing emotions, it has only a negative meaning. So again, we're calling anger two things in there. One is, first, it's a mental factor. Mental factors, again, I talked about that a little bit last week, but essentially we have all these different mental factors that are happening in our minds, sometimes simultaneously. And what's happening with anger in particular is that it is arising together with a mental factor of feeling. Feeling is a feeling tone. It's not the whole range of feelings. Like if you went to your therapist and they ask you, "Well, how are you feeling today?" And you go into a whole story about all the various things that are going on. That is not what we mean by feeling here. By feeling, we mean just simply a kind of sensory tone or feeling tone that we have in our mental landscape at any particular time. At any time, we are encountering something that is either pleasant, something that is neutral, or something that is unpleasant. Anger, of course, is the response to something that is unpleasant. It's inducing an unpleasant sensation in us due to our karmic relationship with that particular object. So there is a role that an object is playing in this. We're going to look at this shortly. But nonetheless, that object for us, when we come into contact with it, induces something that is unpleasant for us. It can be the sound of a certain politician's voice, or it can be, the sight of, something going on in our world that we don't like, or it can be the actions of a neighbor that they've done, what have you, that have offended us. There are all different things that we can bring into our field of experience and generate this mind of anger towards. Anger is essentially relating to that in a exaggerated way. This is something we're going to be seeing. It's overlaying on that unpleasantness, even more unpleasantness. And of course, it's a reaction to that unpleasant situation that can be of various dimensions, as was set out. It can be, everything from just a minor irritation or annoyance all the way up to, again, kind of full-blown rage. Um, then the last thing that was pointed out, let's put that back on the screen, had to do with the fact that in English, we sometimes use anger to mean a kind of justifiable anger. I'm not going to read that next passage. That's from His Holiness's book, but he talks about that, how he really does feel like we do need to distinguish forms of anger that need to be generated in response to the harm we see in our world. So again, if we look at the world that we are living in currently, and there certainly is once more no shortage of things that we might find unpleasant or that register those kinds of feelings with us, we can oppose some of the beings, people that are involved in some of those actions or things that they're doing or saying, but we can still hold the person as worthy of thoughts of compassion, love, and so on, which is one of the antidotes we're going to look at in this course. The idea is to be able to separate out, this is what I mentioned a bit last week as well, the person from their actions, from their behavior. And so this justifiable anger that His Holiness speaks to frequently is where we are angry and upset at the behavior that beings are engaging in. That needs to cease, needs to stop because it's harming ourselves or harming others. There's nothing wrong in a sense with being opposed to those actions. Now, when it's just harming us, maybe we can develop a little more tolerance around painful situations or being insulted or whatever the case might be. But when it's involving other beings, other people, or other beings in this world, then we should be having that kind of righteous anger, that response to what's going on in our world. In this context, though, what I'm going to be talking about for the remaining, session tonight, as well as the sessions to come, we're going to be talking about it as an affliction or a delusion. It's an affliction in that it is once more not seeing things in a correct way or motivated by wholesome thoughts. It is seeing things in an incorrect way and once more causing a disturbance in our minds. This idea of like anger being an affliction, delusion, disturbing emotion, or destructive emotion, these are different words for the same idea. There's that idea of it afflicting our minds, causing us suffering when it arises, and we're going to go into that tonight when we talk about the disadvantages of anger. It's upsetting to have anger in our minds, right? Secondly, it's a delusion because it's not seeing things correctly. It is actually distorting reality. It's coming from a place of a deeper distortion that we'll go into later in this course, but then it's building again on top of what is unpleasant, all this additional exaggeration that isn't there at all. And the third thing, a destructive or disturbing emotion, we can see that too, how it is destructive for ourselves and destructive for others. Anger is said to be the most destructive of the emotions, certainly in terms of its more immediate effect. That when we have a mind of anger, look at the things that people engage in. Look at the harm they do to their loved ones, even when they are angry or upset at them, much less people who they strongly oppose. So we have this mind of anger that again runs pretty rampant in our culture. But as Shantideva pointed out, it was rampant in his culture too. It's not something new to this world in terms of our own time. So let's look at patience on the other hand. Patience, she describes, is an alternative to either expressing or suppressing anger. She had been talking about that in the section just prior to that passage. This is what often we do in Western psychology, right? Is we say that it's really good to express your anger. They even have some therapists work with these wild techniques. I did this actually with one workshop I was involved in, where you have like these phone books, really thick phone books, and you used a radiator hose to like wail on the phone books to kind of get your anger out, right? Expressing your anger, I don't know, didn't work for me. It just doesn't seem like it really is that helpful of a tool. Suppressing your anger can be even worse, where you just say, I'm just going to keep stuffing my anger inside because eventually it's like a volcano and it blows. So the alternative to those is, of course, practicing patience, or sometimes called tolerance. It is the ability to remain internally calm and undisturbed in the face of harm or difficulties. So it's something that we actually can cultivate. And what we're going to be looking at in this course is all the various techniques that help us to generate that mind of patience that is not disturbed by the emotions at that, or the unpleasant sensations at that time, not having these emotions of anger, frustration, annoyance, and so on arise. She goes on to say, which is kind of interesting, the Sanskrit word Shanti, which is, of course, the first part of Shantideva's name. Deva, of course, is God, so he's the god of peace, Shantideva. Anyway, it says there's no equivalent in English to this term, Shanti. But here we use patience, but Shanti also includes tolerance, internal calm, endurance, and as I said, sort of peace. It's a peaceful mind, a state that is not agitated. Thus, patience, she says, as it is used here, also includes these qualities. So we're looking for this idea of being able to cultivate a mind that is not going to react, of course, to the things that are going on around us. It's going to be more responsive to what's going on around us, being grounded in this state of peace, being tolerant, having that calm. I'm going to read a little bit more from Geshe Acharya Lodin. This is his wonderful Lam Rim book that uh, uh, has, really, he's a contemporary Lama, so his teachings are really quite nice on the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. Patience is a virtuous mind, he says, that can remain indifferent to any form of harm inflicted by others. It can voluntarily endure any form of suffering, and it can remain definitely thinking about the Dharma. Those are speaking essentially to the three types of patience, because we can see that there are different things that can annoy us. First is the harm that others inflict to us, right? That's a really big one. Secondly, any other form of suffering we have to endure. Sometimes we get angry and upset at illness in the body or things that are just going on that are inconvenient for us, right? It may not be a person that's involved. It's just the nature of, our lives, to occasionally throw stuff at us. And then the final one, to remain definitely thinking about the Dharma, meaning the patience it takes to actually engage in these teachings, the patience it takes to even practice what I'm going to be presenting to you over these 4 sessions. You need to have some patience around trying to get your mind to change and so on. So again, patience has different flavors in that regard. To conclude, he says, patience guards your mind from being disturbed by any harm or difficulty. So again, we talked a little bit about mind last week, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but she does introduce it in terms of talking about what we're referring to when we talk about mind. It's essentially the experiential, cognitive, intellectual, perceptual, and feeling part of us. By feeling there, she means like that kind of emotional part of us, right? Sometimes we we put heart and mind together in Buddhism. There's not something separate that we call heart, the feeling, the more emotive qualities that we have versus mind that is more intellectual. We do that in the West, right? We say kind of head and heart. But all of this is combined in what we mean by mind. And of course, that's the main workshop for everything the Buddha taught. So as it says a little further down, anger, like all emotions, is a type of mind. Once more, it's a mental factor that accompanies our mental consciousness. I just want to point this out. We do have a lot of things that we experience through our 5 senses. Right now, you're experiencing the visual of looking at the words and watching me. Your ear consciousness is registering the words and so on. Those 5 sense consciousnesses are kind of dumb consciousnesses. I'm not trying to put them down. They're the way that we know our world, but it's just bringing in raw data. The mental consciousness is the real workshop, and of course, is also where we get into a lot of trouble because it's the mental consciousness that begins to work with the ideas of all these things that we experience and to sometimes distort them greatly. This is the process we're going to look at in terms of how anger arises. But the idea here is that you might be accompanying, certainly when you're having like an ear consciousness. For example, if you're hearing music that you find really annoying, or maybe the neighbors down the street are yelling and screaming at each other, and you just are getting annoyed by it because you're trying to sit peacefully in your yard and read a book or something. Well, again, you do have an ear consciousness that's being generated, but the ear consciousness doesn't have anger. The ear consciousness, once more, is just a receptor for all of those sounds, the movement of molecules that are registering in our eardrum and so on, that are giving the raw data that our mental consciousness begins to form into ideas. Those ideas are what are being worked with, that anger is arising on the basis of those thoughts. It is interesting, this is coming up in one of the passages soon, that anger is, like all of the afflictive emotions, a conceptual mind. I know that we normally feel anger as like this physical sensation where you get kind of flushed and very tight and the heart starts racing a bit and what have you. It does register in the body by, there's no conflict there. The physical effects of these emotions are often there. But we're not talking about just the physical effects. The mind of anger is what we're mainly focusing on, and that's the thoughts that we are having that are supporting that reaction to things. That mind of anger is actually a thought process, albeit very quickly, that we are so deeply ingrained to doing that we don't sit there and go, oh, this is an annoying sound. Should I get upset at this or not? We don't go into sort of a process whether we should have anger or not. Instead, anger just simply arises because we are so habituated to it. But it is a thought process at its core. All of the afflictive emotions have thought processes at their core. So let's take a look at this. I think it's coming up later on um, this page. Yeah, it's right there in the green, a little bit further down. From a Buddhist perspective, many emotions, such as anger, have a feeling component. As I was saying, there is definitely that unpleasant feeling that we're having and the emotions that come up around that, but they are conceptual, for they know their objects by means of a mental image. We talk about this just a little bit. This is one of the topics that we go into in the course on minds and mental factors, is kind of discussing how conception knows things. Your 5 sense consciousnesses, again, are not conceptual. They are what we call perception, meaning that the raw data appears to them and it's just transmitted in its raw form. It's appearing, in a way that it can be directly accessed. When we think about things through our mental consciousness and our conceptual mind, then there's always an idea of something, what was called in the text there, a mental image. And by image, don't think it's something purely visual related. Again, your mental consciousness is not your eye consciousness, so it's not something visual to begin with. But if I said, certainly, think about a strawberry right now, you could bring to mind the visual of a strawberry, right? We all know what they look like, the redness of a strawberry, the shape of it, the little seeds that are embedded in the skin, the little green top to it, what have you. We can visualize that, right? That's a mental image of the visual form of a strawberry, its shape and color. But I can also ask you to have a mental image of the taste of a strawberry, which you could bring to mind right now, because I think we've all tasted strawberries. Hopefully, if you're allergic to strawberries, and you haven't, but hopefully you haven't had that. But the idea is that when we put that on our tongue and we actually taste the strawberry, it's another image that we have, an idea that we have of strawberry. The taste of strawberry is a mental construct. It's a conceptual idea of what we mean by that experience. So again, we have these two different ways of knowing. Your direct perception, that is knowing things in the field of our awareness there, and we do have some moments of mental direct perception. I'm not going to go into that right now. The other one is our mental consciousness, which is primarily conceptual mind. And conceptual mind is a problem for us in terms of how it is misknowing things, but it is also the solution to our problems in terms of correctly knowing things. So when we talk about anger, attachment, jealousy, greed, all these various mental factors that are unwholesome, as well as even factors like faith and non-harmfulness and so on, compassion, all of these are also conceptual. So the conceptual mind is going to be, again, where we are looking at anger arising and where we are looking at patience arising. Patience is a mind that we generate that is conceptual, that is the antidote to that anger. And again, it can be informed by many things. This is what we're going to be looking at throughout this course, is all this kind of variety of things that we can bring to mind, things that we can change in our minds so that we don't have the arisal of anger. Instead, we have the undisturbed mind of patience, tolerance. So the next section that I'm going to go into has to do with kind of the factors involved in the arising of anger. And I just want to mention there's another presentation where they talk about 6 factors that give rise to the afflictions. I'm going to leave off 3 of them because they're not as important to our discussion here. But I do want to highlight how these various delusions arise, and of course, how the mind of anger more specifically arises. The very first of these 3 main causes or factors is the fact that we have seeds of anger on our minds. This is, of course, something because we've had minds since beginningless time, as I mentioned last week, there's no beginning to our minds. Then we've always had the seeds of anger because the seeds of anger are what are planted in our minds from having had anger arise in another moment. Every moment we have anger, we plant another seed for anger to arise in the future. That cause, of course, cannot be really gotten rid of until we're further on the path. You can uproot all of those seeds of anger, as well as the seeds of ignorance, as well as the ignorance itself, and the anger, and the attachment, and the jealousy, all the various things that are in the mind that afflict our minds, those delusions, disturbing emotions, they can be gotten rid of. And we'll look at the final antidote to anger and to all of those towards the end of this course when we talk about the wisdom of emptiness. But essentially, until we do that work, we are going to have these seeds. They are kind of waiting in the background to ripen into their particular delusion. In this case, we're talking about the seeds of anger. The second thing that plays a role is, of course, the object. And by object, once more, we aren't meaning like a physical object out there. It can be anything that comes into our field of experience through our 5 senses, or even is remembered or brought to mind through our conceptual mind. You can have a mental object that you are getting upset at. In fact, when we are taking that sort of snapshot of what's going on outside and working with it in our conceptual mind, we're working purely with a mental image. We're kind of taking that and we're using that as a sort of trigger for this mind of anger to arise. It's, in the case of anger, as I was saying earlier, something that creates an unpleasant feeling for us. So again, we can look at our own lives, and you did this a bit, hopefully, in the meditation tonight, to see your own experience around anger and what are the things that trigger you? What are those situations where you've had that mind of anger arising? It could be a particular person in your family or a neighbor or whatever who irritates you. It could even be someone who's very close to you, but they have a particular way of acting or talking about something that you find that is what triggers you, is the way that they say certain things or the way that they do certain things. We have many of these triggers again out there. So if we have the first one, the seed of anger, and the second one, the object that will induce an unpleasant feeling for us, it's not necessarily the case that we're going to have anger, because it really depends upon the third of these three main causes, which is going to be called in our the passage from Venerable Children, inappropriate attention. What does that mean? It means mistaken thoughts, mistaken conceptions. That we're going to be looking at that object and seeing it in a particular way that causes us to awaken one of those seeds, so that the mind of anger arises on the basis of the thoughts that we're having. So this is why we're really looking at throughout this course, how do we change this third one? The first line of defense often is to, I got to avoid the object, because we don't have the strength of mind to be patient in the face of most objects, right? There are certain objects that are very triggering for us. It's the same as when we're dealing with addictive patterns in the site of attachment, right? If you have somebody who has developed an addiction for a particular substance or has a alcoholism, where there are a lot of issues around alcohol, well, the first thing is to separate yourself from the object, right? Get all the alcohol out of the house. Stop hanging out with your drinking buddies. Do whatever you can to remove that object, so you have some line of defense so that you're not thinking about it and tempted by it constantly. The same goes for these three factors. The initial line of defense might be, yes, isolate myself from that object. But as Master Shantideva was saying, you're going to step on a thorny object here or there somewhere along the line, right? So we have to learn to cover our feet. We have to learn to be able to be in the world so that those objects that are going to come into our lives don't trigger us, don't cause the mind of anger to arise. So what we're really working on, again, is this third idea. How do we change this inappropriate mental attention or thinking into something that is appropriate and wholesome and supports the mind of patience? And this is the essence of Buddhist psychology. I mentioned that last time, right? That we're essentially trying to replace what is an unhealthy, negative emotion with a very healthy and truth-grounded positive emotion. And in this case, we're working with anger and patience. Of course, the patience gets supported by a lot of other thoughts that we can see are in line with reality, that are actually speaking the truth to us. Whereas anger is telling big fat lies to us all the time. So let's go ahead and take a look at this passage that Venerable Children, where she goes into a bit more about this inappropriate attention, she calls it, again, sometimes called mistaken conceptualizations. But she says the forerunner to anger is a mental factor called inappropriate attention, that in this case exaggerates the negative qualities of a person, object, situation, or idea, and projects onto it negative qualities that are not there, thus creating an incorrect story about it. So once more, we are having an experience of that object inducing unpleasantness, right? That's the starting point. That second factor that plays a role is an object that for us induces unpleasantness. Now let's use the example that I often use, which is music, because we all have such varied tastes in music, right? So say, you hear somebody coming down the street with music blaring from their speakers, and it's the music that induces an unpleasant sensation for you. You find it so annoying, so irritating that that music is playing, and say the car even like parks in front of where you are, and the music is just kind of blaring out there, out in front of where you live. Maybe again, you're trying to do something that requires a bit more focus and attention. So you begin to exaggerate the unpleasantness of that. The very root of it is that you think that the music is inherently unpleasant. That's the error we're going to get to a little bit later in this course, is thinking that that unpleasantness is embedded in the object. that there's no way that you could hear that music and not find it unpleasant. But once more, that's your experience, right? The person who's out in the car listening to it at full volume or whatever, and they're enjoying it, right? That's their music. That's what gives them enjoyment in the same way that whatever music brings you enjoyment, that you have that experience, right? So we are having a mistaken idea right from the get-go with this because we think that the unpleasantness is inherent in the object. Of course, we also think the identity is inherent within it. That's the even deeper error. But the idea is we start with that and then we exaggerate on top of it. We make it worse and worse and worse. We think this just becomes like this huge, unbelievable thing. And we might even get on the phone or something or text somebody and say, you won't believe the obnoxious noise that this neighbor is making by being out there in their car playing their music, da 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 da. We exaggerate that to, these extreme limits. And it just feeds our anger, right? We get more and more frustrated. We might even get to the level of rage. Maybe this is somebody who you've encountered a number of times. This is a familiar object to you, them playing their music out there. And you go out there and get angry and upset at them. Maybe, you get a baseball bat and start wailing on their car if you're extreme. I mean, this is what happens in our world, right? It's all a progression of ideas, a progression of thoughts that brings us to the point where we confront them, say something to them, do something to them, but it's a mental process that got us there. And it's an exaggeration that it's built upon. It's not in line with reality. Again, I'm not saying that you aren't hearing something that is unpleasant for you. That's not the message. It's just that that in and of itself is not being seen correctly by the mind of anger. It is being exaggerated, embellished, made into something that is even greater than what is there in terms of your basic experience of that. But as I was pointing out, even your basic experience of that is not something that's inherently there. It's not unpleasant by its own nature. I mean, I've even had cases certainly where I, listened to some music and found it really pleasant, and then somebody will play it for me again years later, and I'll go turn that noise off or whatever, right? Because we change, everything changes. It's a very fluid world that we live in. So we have to be kind of aware of the fact that we are the ones creating the mind of anger. I hope you'll notice that as I go through this, I'm going to do my best to be meticulous on this. I'm always going to talk about the mind of anger or having the mind of anger. I don't like to use the word angry people or being angry because I think it's too much of an identification with that emotion. So something that's pointed out, very often is that we can have kind of three different levels. We can say, I have anger in my mind, which is what I'm going to try to focus on using all the time. The second one is where we begin to say, I am angry. We start to think that I am angry. It becomes almost an equivalency that we're making. The person, me, is angry. And the third one is where we become like we make those statements to other people. Oh, I'm just an angry person. This is just who I am. We identify with it so much that we think that that's our very nature. And of course, those sorts of mindsets don't lend themselves to working with anger because if we think that we're cast in stone and that we're always going to have anger in our minds, we think we're an angry person. Some people say that, right? I'm just an angry person and can't do anything about my anger, right? Well, no, that's not true. We all have an ability to diminish our anger and to eventually eliminate it. So again, this is what's happening. I might read the example that she uses here to give another illustration of this from Venerable Children's book. So she says here, for example, Dave, some imaginary Dave, walks into the office one morning and his colleague, who is preoccupied, doesn't greet him. He thinks, well, this person is unfriendly and rude. And based on this inappropriate attention, that projected meaning and motivation onto the other's action, he becomes irritated. His internal irritation leads to external action, and Dave makes a sarcastic remark, which then hurts his colleague, and she in turn snaps back at him. We can see how easily one instant of inappropriate attention and anger can set off a chain reaction of events, causing ourselves and others misery. Because again, oftentimes we don't know what's going on for the other person at all. And that's another layer of exaggeration or embellishment, right? Where we make up all this stuff about who they are. Oh, somebody new moved into the neighborhood and they're the worst neighbor. They must be, so callous, so cruel, whatever, on the basis of one experience we have with them. and we don't even know what's going on for them. We don't know what's happening with them. So again, there's lots of exaggeration that can happen with all of this. If we were seeing things truthfully, or even just in a conventional way, seeing them as what is essentially going on, what is happening is, yes, you have a seed of anger in your mind. You're having a sound or an experience that is unpleasant for you. That's the object. But you can think about it in a totally different way. You can think about it just as that. Oh, I'm just having this, experience of something unpleasant. This will pass, right? We're going to talk about that as an antidote, knowing the impermanence of it, that nothing lasts. Any unpleasant experience you've had in this life is finished. It's come to a conclusion. I mean, hopefully you don't have something that you're dragging on forever. But even so, it diminishes at times, or it's not always present in the way that we thought it was. So this is the nature of the mind of anger. It's doing this embellishment. It's adding on things. What I want to do to illustrate this, and this gets us actually into the first practice that I want to talk about tonight, that I hope you can work with over the next week. Many of you have had teachings on this before. This comes from the Salata Sutta in the Pali Canon. And this is from this website, American Buddhist, where this one practitioner or teacher, I don't know who, was talking about this. I couldn't identify who the person was that posted this, but it was a nice description of it because I've seen much longer ones, and this one kind of gets to the heart of the matter. It says, there is a classic Buddhist parable of the two arrows. In brief, the idea is that most people, when hurt, add to the hurt. If shot with an arrow, we spend a lot of effort focused on wondering why we got shot, how we didn't deserve that, how the person who shot the arrow is a jerk, what we are going to say when we get in front of him or her, and so on. It's like being struck by a second arrow. The first one is physical in this case, and the second is mental. In contrast, if we are able to maintain our mindfulness and not spin off into a story about our pain, we only get struck by one arrow. And that's the object. The object is going to exist for you at times. You're going to have unpleasant experiences in this life. We all know this, right? That one arrow causes its own pain, but we don't have to pierce ourselves with a second one. And then I like how this author, he goes a little further. He says, I might even go further than this. Once we start down the story road, we not only make ourselves feel worse, which again was that second arrow, but then we are more likely to do something that makes the situation worse. And that's actually the third arrow. Now, the Buddha didn't teach three arrows. I'm not, it's not in the Salata Sutta. He mainly is talking about these two. And he identified the first one as mainly being physical, but we can also have some mental experiences, like to think about later the harm that somebody caused us. Just to bring that to mind, oh, those words that that person said that were so cutting and so hurtful. And then we once more go into that spinning out, that second arrow. The second arrow is completely optional. Now, we can get rid of the first arrow eventually through deeper Buddhist work. That's the goal, is eventually to be free of all dukkha, all unsatisfactory experiences. But in the state that we're in currently, we're going to have those first arrows. First arrows are happening around us all the time, right? Turn on the news. There's, somebody appearing who you don't like, who you are opposed to, and they're saying things, and you just have to kind of take those arrows in. The second arrow is where we have the workshop. That's the mental consciousness, specifically the conceptual mind, that is going to start ruminating and focusing on that in an unhealthy way, telling ourselves, again, all kinds of stories about it, all kinds of things that we're making up about it. I might mention that one of the other three factors that we get that kind of feeds into our afflictions, it's worth noting, is the influence of people who are not such good people to hang around with, what we might call misleading friends. And in this day and age, that happens a lot, right? All you got to do is get on Facebook or I don't know if anyone uses Twitter. It's X now, right, or something. And there's Blue Sky, all these different. You just get on someplace and you start posting things, and you get immediate affirmation of everything that you're saying, right? All your thoughts about that person or that situation, what's going on in our world. So we do have a lot of things that feed into embellishing this thought, making this thought stronger and stronger. But that's totally second arrow stuff. The first arrow is happening. I'm not denying that. And again, over time, we can actually get to a place where there aren't so many first arrows because we're not creating the karma to have painful experiences in our lives. But until we're free of samsara, until we're free of the round of existence, we're going to continue to have things in our lives that are going to be irritating, annoying, or even induce more, stronger thoughts than that. But that unpleasant object is, we can leave it there. We don't need to have the third thing. The third thing in this set of these three, the seed, the object, and the inappropriate attention, that's the second arrow. The first arrow is the object. So what I have put together for you for practicing this is the first of these. And by the way, in the Gompa here, we do have some of these printed out, thanks to John printing them out before. This is the set of practices. And what I'm doing with most of these practices is having you investigate with questions. Questions are really useful. I mean, if I just kind of stated it all for you, then you could reflect on that. But these are questions that can guide you, and you don't have to necessarily do all of them. But this is a whole exercise around becoming aware of the arising of anger in whatever level it might be throughout that range, again, from irritation to rage. So use the following questions to help you increase your awareness of when anger arises and the various elements involved in each occurrence. So I divided it into the first section, the first arrow. What is the object, person, situation, and so on that is triggering your anger? I use this word triggering. It's used in Western psychology a lot. We don't use it maybe in Buddhism quite as much, but it's what's happening. We're being triggered usually for anger to arise on the basis of a particular first arrow. Is this something that you have encountered previously? In other words, do you have some habit around this? So you have anger arising very often whenever that particular object comes into your field of experience. Again, it can be a person, a situation, whatever. Third, what specifically is it about the object which makes it a trigger for you? This is maybe an investigation that's worth doing a little bit of to see if you can really put your finger on what it is that is the unpleasantness about that. Because it's inducing an unpleasant feeling, but we might be once more, already at this point, getting entangled with it in an unhealthy way because we're seeing it as kind of an inherent trigger for us, having its own nature as an unpleasant object. Fourth, do you think it's also a trigger for everyone else? Just like the example of the music, right? If you have that music that's playing that you don't like, does that mean that everyone else is going to find that music to be a trigger for their anger? And then fifth, what would it look like for you to avoid the object? That's once more that first line of defense. And that's worth investigating because initially it is good to have some distance between ourselves and the object. I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to emphasize that. Go back to the example of those who deal with substance abuse or alcoholism. They need to have a buffer zone where they're not near those objects. Get it all out of the house. Don't go out with the people that are going to be using those objects, those substances, whatever. And then over time, some people who work with their minds very well through the process of recovery and what have you are able to be back in the presence of alcohol and other drugs and not have the temptation for that pattern of addiction to arise. Not everybody, but nonetheless. The point is that if you have that initial distance, then you've got a better kind of zone in which you can work with these. We're going to go through some of the instructions that I'm going to give in terms of the individual techniques and how to work with them. I'll go into each one of them, but in general, how we work with them is that we become familiar with them so that we can bring them to mind when we are in the presence of the object. But for some of us, the initial stage is just to remove ourselves from that object. If you're getting together with friends and there's one particular person who seems to tag along sometimes that you really can't stand, well, if you find them as an object of your anger, well, then maybe you don't go for a while. Maybe when you hear that they're coming, oh, is so-and-so coming? Oh, I think I'll pass then or whatever, and you don't go until you have better skills and abilities to be in their presence and to be patient and to not start blurting out all kinds of rude things to them or whatever. So that's the idea behind this. The first arrow can only be avoided to a degree, though, as I was saying. It comes down to mainly working with the second arrow. The second arrow, what are the thoughts that followed upon experiencing that trigger? And try to really be again, if this is after the fact, of course, then you're analyzing it and you're looking at, well, what was I thinking when that particular sensation or whatever occurred? Secondly, if you have encountered this situation before, are the thoughts you now have similar to what you had on other occasions? So if this is a habitual object for you, are the thoughts kind of regurgitating themselves? Are you, recycling those thoughts? Third, why do you think that you're having those thoughts? This is again a maybe deeper investigation. We're trying to get at, well, what is really going on here? What is my thought process that is causing those thoughts to arise, that inappropriate attention that is feeding into my anger? Fourth, do you think everyone else would have similar thoughts? Once more, that idea that the trigger could be different for people, maybe the thoughts would also be different for people. So just to give some space in our minds that what we are believing and thinking at that particular time is not cast in stone, not what everyone would think in response to that object or in reaction to that object. Number five, if your thoughts subsequently led to reacting to the situation or object, which once more is that third arrow, what factors played a role in that reaction? What contributed to it that made you go from just having the irritation in your mind to actually saying something to that person or doing something to potentially harm them? Number six, can you imagine responding more constructively to the situation? That's just to give you that space for what we're going to do in this course, which is the willingness to say, how could I actually reframe things and not have the mind of anger arise, rather the mind of patience? And then finally, number seven, what thoughts might support reducing anger and having a more beneficial outcome to the situation? This is just once more an open-ended kind of investigation as to, can you think of now any particular thoughts that might be useful for you? I'm going to be introducing a whole lot of thoughts, go through this, that I'm hoping will be useful to you. I'm hoping that they will give you an opportunity to change your mind, to actually have the mind of patience more often than you have the mind of anger. So let me check in and see if there are any questions at this point before I go on to the next part. Yes, there's a question from Texas.
Ah,
There we go.
Hey, Don, I just wanted to say that in the beginning, it was really helpful to have the difference between perception and, conception cleared up. It
Good,
really helped. Thank you.
good.
That's
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that. It really did help.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Yeah. No, this is a really important distinction because, yeah, it's not our senses that get us in trouble per se, though our senses are bringing in that raw data. And of course, we, through our thoughts, go, oh, yeah, let's go after that, or let's stay away from that, or whatever the case might be. But the conceptual mind is once more, the problem, but it's also the solution. That's the nice thing to know about it. We can unravel those thoughts and replace them with healthier ones. Shall we move on then? Carry on? Okay. So again, I have a little bit more in this. I just want to go through a few bits that have to do with this idea of kind of investigating anger and patience, more on the arising of anger. I just wanted to go through a few points that are mentioned here. This is His Holiness's commentary, Healing Anger, on Shantideva's chapter 6 on patience. He says, if we examine how anger or hateful thoughts arise in us, we will find that, generally speaking, they arise when we feel hurt, when we feel that we have been unfairly treated by someone against our expectations. If in that instant we examine carefully the way anger arises, there is a sense that it comes as a protector. This is one of the things that we might, when we're investigating our anger in terms of particular situations, sometimes anger seems to be like, our big sister or big brother or whoever that's like there to protect us. And it actually is not doing that at all. That's an illusion. That's a delusory state of mind, His Holiness says. It feels that way. It feels like this is our defense, like this is the way that we're going to actually take care of ourselves. But in the end, we actually do more harm to ourselves. Then to continue with some other ideas that are around how and why anger arises. Venerable Chodron says, once more repeating what we said earlier, anger is inaccurate in its assessment of reality because by definition, it is based on exaggeration or superimposition of negative qualities. However, when we are angry, and she uses when we are angry, I'll say when we have anger, we don't feel that we're exaggerating or superimposing anything. We feel that we're right. In fact, the mind of anger seems to be very clear. I'm right, you're wrong, you need to change. And this is very true, right? We are so convinced that what this third fact, this third element of this inappropriate attention, the story it is telling us, is absolutely true. So we don't even necessarily want to change sometimes because we want to believe in that lie. We want to believe in that exaggeration because it validates the feelings we have around that person. The unpleasantness of their voice or the way what they wear or the things that they, like or whatever the case might be. And so we keep feeding that and we're not so easily convinced of something that is contrary to that because we believe it to be real. And that's one of the worst things is that we get so embedded. I mean, I have to say, taking it back off screen for a minute, the division that's happening in our country is due to a lot of this, I think. People really getting so deeply entrenched in how they view things and what they are upset and angry about, thinking that anyone who doesn't see that must be blind, right? Again, I'm not denying that there's some way we have to sift through all this and find what is true and what is right and what is beneficial. There are those criteria that we can attend to. But the fact is we get stuck in these mindsets that cause more division and more inability for people to cross that bridge and reconcile their differences. This is happening in our society and in the United States, but it's happening all around the world. So we do have to be kind of seeing the larger effects that we have, that these states of mind have on ourselves and the people around us and, whoever it is that we agree with, who we disagree with. Then that next little sentence there, under the influence of anger, we select a few negative details and form a limited view that we are reluctant to change. It's a limited view in that it's not seeing the whole picture. We need to have a different perspective to see the whole picture. I mentioned that last week. That was one of the very first of the 4 points that Dr. Chodak mentioned, right? That we need to change our perspective to see the bigger picture. So again, we're not seeing things correctly. I don't know that I need to say much more on that. Let me just finish this section off. There's one little bit more on this this next page. It says here, holding on to and nurturing a fixed, inaccurate, let me move this out of the way for the folks here. I've got what I'm showing on the screen that on the TV was blocked there. Holding on to and nurturing a fixed, inaccurate opinion of someone also breeds suspicion and continual unhappiness. This is one of the other things that's involved in the mind of anger arising, is that it makes us very suspicious of others. And it, of course, feeds into what we're calling here again our unhappiness, our mental unhappiness. So again, just be aware of how that is what is happening. We're getting very fixed, very convinced of that particular view that we have, and becoming very distrustful of others who are and seen in the light of that view as being negative, as being bad, as being evil, or whatever the case might be. I found this really interesting, and it's very much borne out by research that's done around emotions. It says psychologists speak of a refractory period. It's actually called the psychological refractory period, PRP, that accompanies an emotion. During this time, we are closed to any advice or reasonable interpretation that contradicts our view. We can neither think clearly about a situation nor accept other interpretations of it that well-meaning people offer. The refractory period, it's kind of interesting, may be short, just a few seconds, or it actually may last years and even decades, where we get so entrenched in a thought about somebody or an occurrence, a situation, that we cannot move our minds from that. This refractory period, again, is where the mind almost solidifies around a particular way of looking at things. For many of us, it only will be seconds, where then suddenly something might shift or change, and then we can let go of it. What we're going to be working with once more in this course is ways of introducing other thoughts that will induce that shift, that will help us to get out of those more habitual ways of getting entrenched in our views. But notice how over time, some people get pretty deeply involved in thoughts they have about a particular person or a situation, something that happened in their lives, and they hold on to that stuff with the same thoughts that they just keep strengthening over time. Look at the pain that's caused by that. Families that have been separated by those sorts of things and so on, right? So just a little bit more on this page. Anger, it says there towards the center, maybe move it up just a little bit if I can get my cursor right there. There. Oops. Sorry. Didn't mean to do that. Whoops. Where did it go? It went all the way down to there. Sorry, let me get it back up here. If I can do that. Sorry for all the fast movement there. Okay. There, at the top, very top of the screen. Anger is also inaccurate in its assessment of reality, in that it does not perceive a situation in a balanced way, but views it through the distorted filter of me, I, my, and mind. This, of course, is hinting at once more that deeper error that we're making of thinking that it's all about us. It can happen at a grosser level in terms of the self-centeredness, but it also acts in terms of the self-grasping, this deeper belief and conviction in a real I that is at the underneath all of this stuff that's going on. But of course, that's the filter that we look at things generally, is through how it relates to ourselves. Continuing in that next paragraph, due to this ingrained self-centered view, anything that happens in relation to me seems incredibly important. I spend my time thinking about my problems, not anyone else's. That is, unless I'm attached to that person. Sometimes we will think about someone else's problems if we're close to them. But this is that mind, again, that becomes very tightly focused on me, myself, and I, and how I need to be tended to in the midst of whatever is going on around me. So we go back to the example of the person out in their car enjoying their music that they happen to be playing loud, and I'm hearing that music and having that unpleasant sensation. I'm not thinking of them at this time, right? When I'm getting annoyed and perturbed by that sound out there, I'm only thinking about me. How can they do this to me? I'm sitting in my room trying to read a book and listen to some quiet music, and they're out there with the blum, blum, blum blaring, you know? So again, this is where we're tending to react from a very distorted place to begin with, that we think everything is all about me. I mean, look at this. This is the source of wars. We're going to get into this. I'm not going to go through. I'm not going to have time to go through, line by line of all of the commentary, the readings that I put together for you. But that's the source of all the wars in the world, is the inability to see things from another person's point of view. I'm amazed, and I'm not trying to. I'm doing anything but taking sides in the whole Israel-Gaza thing. I want it just to completely end and for there to be peace between two peoples that need to find a way to get that. But the reality is, it seems like no matter what happens, there's an inconsideration of the other side and the other side's needs. And so it becomes this entanglement of just seeing it only from one point of view. It's only according to Israel's needs or only according to Gaza's needs, and never really finding the common ground where we can say, okay, let's see it from a different perspective. So the mind of anger is very self-centered, thinking about ourselves or those, again, that we feel quite close to. So there's a comment or question here from Mary Jo, please.
I'm thinking about the music incident,
Uh-huh.
but that is self-centered on both points of view. The person playing the music is just oblivious,
Sure. Sure.
Me, my music, I want it.
Yeah.
And, it seems to me like that self-centered focus breeds a lot of difficulty.
It does. It does. I mean, because again, as you're pointing out, there is a self-centeredness on both sides of it.
Mhm.
But even if it wasn't like the blare, blare, blare of music or something, if it was like, say you live next door to some people and they decided to have a yard party one day, and maybe their music was quite contained, but it was a lot of people just enjoying themselves, laughing a lot, and they're having a good time in the yard right next to us. But we're annoyed because, again, we're trying to do something that requires quiet or concentration or whatever.
Perhaps we were not invited.
Perhaps we were not invited. That's a good point too, but but the reality is that whatever it is, it's our first arrow that we are receiving, and that might be due to someone else's insensitivity. Definitely. I mean, that does happen in our world, but it could just be the way that people do things, that people just like to have a gathering and enjoy their time, just like we like to do that occasionally, have people over and have a little, get together, a meal, what have you. So again, it really depends upon our ability, and what's kind of important here, we're going to look at this later in this course, to see it from the other person's point of view, to actually get outside of just it being about me, myself, and I, and my needs at this time. And then what is it like to think about others, to actually be concerned about them to some degree? Okay, let's carry on, I do want to just introduce these sections. As I said, I don't want to spend too much time on, line by line. But what we get into in this next part is the whole idea of one of the antidotes that I like to introduce at the beginning, which isn't really that much of like, I'm going to replace my mind of anger with patience. Instead, it's going to diminish the tendency to go to anger by virtue of seeing the disadvantages of that state of mind. And even to some degree, look at this topic of using meditation and mindfulness to observe anger. When we have a more kind of objective view of what's going on with anger and it's arising in the mind through some level of mindfulness, we can actually diminish the power of it. So maybe I'll talk about that one a little bit next week, but this whole section where I work with recalling the disadvantages of anger, there's some very beautiful passages in here that talk about, again, the danger of this mind. And there are many things that anger is involved in creating. First of all, that question towards the top there, am I happy when I'm angry? We see it disturbs our peace in the moment, right? That's already one huge disadvantage. Secondly, we don't communicate well when we're angry. Again, or when anger's in our minds, it distorts our view of things. We start saying things that we regret. We aren't, able to express ourselves as calmly or clearly as usual. That's what's mentioned towards the end of that. Under the influence of anger, we also say and do things that we later regret. Um, Anger can also result in people shunning us. There's a lot of isolation that happens through anger. I'll let you read all of these on your own. Again, these passages in this section. In addition, maintaining anger over a long time fosters resentment and bitterness within us. This is a big one, right, that I mentioned earlier, where some people aren't willing to forgive and to move on from things that have happened in the past. I'm not going to talk about forgiveness so much in this course. I have done some teachings here for all of you on forgiveness. It's accompanying the whole process of working with our anger frequently, though, right? Because we do have to, at times, recognize the importance of forgiving people who have harmed us and not holding on to that grudge, that resentment. But nonetheless, we can see that anger has that ability to destroy our peace of mind for years. People who on their deathbed, the person who offended them comes to see them to, have some sort of reconciliation. They say, I don't want to see that person, get them out of here. Imagine on your deathbed still holding on to all of that anger and that, frustration at somebody. So let me just go through with the time that we have left, the practice sheet for this. This is practice number 2. I'll let you read again uh, the various readings that pertain to this. I go into some other more traditional Buddhist ones and so on. Of course, there's the karmic effects of following the mind of anger and the actions we engage in and so on. But for this, I divided this up into the detrimental effects for oneself to begin with. So let's start with that. As it says there at the top, reflect upon your own experiences with anger. Ask these questions to increase your awareness of anger's disadvantages and thus encourage you to practice patience. Sometimes for some smaller incidents of anger, that may be enough. Just go, oh, I don't want to follow that. I know where that goes. I've been on that train before. I know the harmful effects. So again, examine whether you are able to bring these faults to mind as a deterrent to current situations in which you might generate anger. So first, in regard to yourself, the question we mentioned earlier, does it make you feel happy or miserable? I mean, really be honest with yourself. Some people initially might feel angry getting back at somebody by making a snarky remark and being angry at them when they've done something to harm you, but it doesn't continue. You might feel really bad over, even the course of several minutes from that. Number 2, when you have anger, does your mind feel at peace and in control or disturbed and running wild? I mean, it can be somewhere in between there, but obviously it's probably not at peace and in control. How does having anger make you feel physically? What effects does it have on your health? It is interesting. They find that people who have a lot of anger do actually have higher blood pressure or more chance of complications in their health, especially heart health and so on. Have thoughts of anger ever kept you from sleep, ruined your appetite, or adversely impacted some other aspect of your life? Maybe you couldn't even enjoy a vacation. You went on vacation and somebody did something to you. Maybe on the process to getting to your vacation destination, you had to deal with all kinds of travel problems or something. And that kept you up then for most of the vacation. You weren't able to even relax because you were so upset at what happened on your way to the destination. Number 5, when anger is in your mind, are you able to communicate your thoughts calmly, clearly, effectively? And if we're honest with ourselves, it's obvious to me that as soon as I have moments of anger arising, I just can't say what I really need to say at that time that's going to be helpful. I'm usually saying stuff that's not helpful, right? Number 7, does your anger ever result in you being shunned? Oh, I'm sorry, skip number 6. When you speak or act from your anger, do you later feel embarrassed, have regret for what you did, feel guilty about your actions, or have self-hatred even? I mean, again, see, might not feel good to reflect back on the things that we've done out of our mind of anger, but we have to own up to that. That's one of the disadvantages for ourselves. Then on to 7, does your anger ever result in you being shunned by others or experiencing more loneliness in your life? In other words, have you upset people that have then abandoned you because they didn't like to be around you when you were having that mind of anger? Number 8, has prolonged anger ever made you bitter or resentful toward others? Thinking about how others appear to you when they are expressing their anger, how do you think you appear at similar times? This is one of they say this is the karmic effect of having had anger in the past, is that we have an undesirable appearance. But if you look at the mind of anger manifesting in a face, and these angry faces, you get all kind of red and the eyes bulging and everything. It's not, it looks like a wrathful deity or something. Number 10, in general, does anger resolve the problem or situation that provoked it, or does it complicate and compound the suffering you were trying to avoid? I mean, just be really practical about it. Anger usually doesn't solve our problems at all. In fact, it can complicate things. But then the second section, where we look at detrimental effects for others, when you have anger in your mind, how does it make others around you feel? I mean, how do we feel when we're around somebody who has anger, right? Just if we or have a hard time thinking about how others might feel at the time when we're having a mind of anger, put yourself in the other position. Number 2, when you express yourself verbally or physically with anger, what effect does that have on others who witness it? It's often really embarrassing to be around somebody who's yelling at somebody out of anger, right? Or even accosting somebody, certainly physically. Do others, let me push the screen up a bit, do others who are the object of your anger tend to be responsive and agreeable? Or do they get hurt by what you did, become inflamed with anger themselves, and possibly even retaliate? How many times do we just inflame the anger of another through our unhealthy response of anger? Number 4, has your expressing anger ever resulted in having ongoing conflict with others, creating damage to a relationship, or even terminating a friendship? You know, I can speak to that experience when I was young, doing something and being kind of selfish and, you know, angry and upset at some of my friends, and that ended it. Has anger become a habitual pattern in a close relationship you have with another, to the point where it becomes commonplace or routine and is simply accepted as part of that relationship? I think this is a really dangerous one. I don't have any readings on this, but I do notice that this sometimes happens, that people kind of, they have this idea of like the old married couple that bickers, right? That they're constantly using this pattern of arguing with each other, where they're kind of angry, and it's become so commonplace that it's just the way it is. Well, that's not a very healthy place to be. It's not a good relationship to be in, right? These are, you know, disadvantage. If we aren't attentive to our anger, then we may get into that sort of situation. Number 6, have you ever physically harmed others or damaged their possessions due to anger, or even your own possessions due to anger? And can you find any real benefits for others from your mind of anger? I mean, does anyone really benefit when we have a mind of anger? I think it's mostly, you know, detriments, no real benefits. So that concludes that practice. That gives you enough to work with for this week. Again, just having some general awareness of how anger arises, and that first arrow, second arrow, idea. And then secondly, to try to start seeing the disadvantages of anger. And as I said, sometimes that may work really quite quickly for those little moments of irritation. Like say, you're at the store and somebody, cuts in front of you or does something and you just kind of go, okay, no, this isn't going to be helpful to the situation. I'll just let them go. I'll just let them, it's not a big deal, right? Uh, anyway. Any questions or comments on what I've talked about tonight then? Online folks, if you want to chime in, please just unmute here in the compa. Yeah, Mary Jo, please.
I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I have I just read somewhere that often there are little, like, a person that is in anger a lot,
Mhm,
that they kind of get in the habit of it, kind of, so it's something that they're used to using, I guess, and it's something very easy, I think, for them to slip into that
Sure.
little groove
Mhm.
that's nicely warm. And I have a friend who suffers
Mm.
from a lot of anger, she says,
Mhm.
and I believe that's like how it is for her.
Sure.
Mm.
That's kind of her default mode, to
Yes,
some degree.
yes,
Yeah,
and she doesn't like it, and she doesn't want it, but it's, she doesn't have this kind of help, and
Mhm.
she just, I think, just slips in that little groove, and
and if we have time, maybe we'll look at, there is a chapter in Venerable Children's book about how to work with someone else with their anger, more skillfully, because it's hard, and again, when is so deeply entrenched, that once more, remember I had the 6 factors. I mentioned how misleading friends is one of them over here that I didn't talk about. Another one is habituation. Why do we have the tendency for anger to arise? For many of us, it's because we've become so habituated to it. It becomes a default mode. It becomes just the way that's how they react to anything that's amiss in their world. Uh, Whatever. You delivered the package at the wrong address. How dare you? Da, 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 don't have the kind of the ease or the patience to be able to say, oh, that's okay. I'm just glad the package is here now and da, 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 or whatever, So it's hard when we see it in people and we know that they could be free of it or at least diminish it to some degree if they just had the tools. But that's once more feeding into why we need to become better adept at using it ourselves first and then being able to share it with others, being able to, help them in their misery, to deal with things. So, yeah, Sarah.
I'm going to be the contrarian here,
Uh-huh.
sorry.
That's all right.
Sometimes I've found in my life, the only way to get someone's attention, get attention of someone is raise your voice, get angry.
Yeah.
If you talk to people oftentimes and quietly state in an assertive but not aggressive manner what you want, you get no response.
Mm.
By anger, raise your voice, stomp around, turn red in the face,
I
It
guess,
does seem to
Yeah.
get people's attention. They pay attention then.
yeah. I mean, there is that phrase, right, of the squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of thing.
Yeah,
But I guess we have to look at it from the point of view of, yeah, that may be how you get their attention, but at what cost? I mean, and that's where we go back to these disadvantages. If we have created only in our minds more of a pattern of using anger in that way and being okay with having that mind that is angry, has anger or is upset with the other person or with the situation, whatever. I think it's tricky. I agree with you that sometimes is what occurs. And like I said, that phrase, the squeaky wheel often does get the attention, right? Because that's the one, like I've been in situations where a flight gets canceled or something, and then everybody runs to the counter to try to get rebooked on another flight or something. And it's the one person who's like the most upset, whatever, that sometimes gets the attention first or whatever of the people so that they can make sure that they're sort of dealt with to kind of calm things down. But it's not really a healthy place for that person to be in. I don't think that, I think the long-term consequences of following that mind and using it as a tool in that way are really pretty detrimental. The person, I mean, I guess we have to look at it from the point of view of, you might say it in that situation, it looks like they win, but do they really win or are they losing in the end by following that mind of anger? So I think it's tricky. There may be ways, and you did mention it, and you said it maybe wasn't as effective to raise our voice or to do something that has, no anger involved in it. It's not really coming from a place of anger, but a way of trying to help get the attention that needs to happen at that moment that isn't involved in anger. I mean, I think this is what happens when children are doing something that they're not supposed to do, right? Especially if it's in danger, there's a danger to the child. If you have a young child who's like putting its hand ready to go for a candle light because it's fascinated by the light of the candle, that flame flickering there, The parent isn't going to go, oh, darling, can you not put your hand over there, right? They're going to say, get your hand away from there. And they're going to say it with a really loud voice that will immediately get the attention. The child might even start crying. But the intention of that parent was to stop them from hurting themselves, you know.
Isn't there something in Buddhism I read a long time ago that you can use anger but not rage?
Well, again, if you're talking about His Holiness's approach that I mentioned earlier tonight, that where he says that there's a sort of justifiable anger where we can have an upsetness at what's going on, like social injustices in our world, you know, that need to be addressed. But they shouldn't be addressed in a manner where the delusion of anger manifests. So this is a tricky balance. And for many of us, it's you can slide over into one or the other very, very quickly. You know, where you start off with this, oh, I'm here to protest this because I really think this needs to be corrected in our world. I've got a compassionate stance. That's why I'm doing all this. But then suddenly in the heat of the moment, you're like screaming at the people who you're protesting against and saying all kinds of nasty things about people and whatever. So you have to be careful because again, that's the difference between whether we're patient and yet doing things that are important in our world, because compassion is important. Addressing the harm that is caused by certain people in the world to others is important, but the people aren't the problem. The action is the problem, and we need to have compassion for the people and not let it become anger towards them. It's tricky, very tricky. Not going to be able to resolve that necessarily through this course, but we just have to work on ourselves in our own individual moments when anger will arise and try to diffuse it, to, again, not suppress it, but to actually do something different in that moment. This is where we're going with the remaining classes. We got let's go ahead and you can take a look at the outline as well. That will be there and it'll show you the various things that I'm going to be going into. But this very first level, at least to work with the disadvantages, and next week we'll talk about meditation and mindfulness. We've got the dedication list. Yeah, Stella's going to read that then. I'll put the camera on.
So this is the new one for April.
Mhm.
For obstacles, John, Mary Jo, Matt. For illness, Jana, Bill, Patty, Rolf, Taryn A, Yolanda, Jane, Dorcas, Jill, Mitchen, BL Westover. Anybody else? For Dad, Lori, Simon Tate, Kate Lockwood, Ella the Mexican Wolf, the Mexican Gray Wolf, Connie, and Mona Lee.
Okay, so if there were any others, you can add them at this time. All right, then let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers. So for those beings, as well as all the beings that are experiencing difficulty and strife in this world at this time, let's dedicate for their welfare, and then also dedicate, of course, for our attainment of enlightenment so we can benefit all beings as quickly as possible. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Sorry, Stella, you can lead, please, if you want. Yeah, I just jumped right in, but go ahead.
May the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta
That has not arisen, arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Yeah, sorry, Stella, I just was kind of jumping ahead. Okay.
long life prayers for His Holiness.
Wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled.
Hito, Venerable One, to you whose kindness
Succeeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us, intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land. Make this request. O Lama, please, please live long.
and a prayer to the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Purely
Teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losam, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you were the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request, while striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Okay, thank you all so much for joining tonight. And again, good luck in working with anger over the next week. It kind of, again, if you find that some of these are working for you, then you might work with them continually. But if you are having difficulty with them, again, do some reflection at night, kind of see what would you do differently? How would you bring those thoughts to mind? How would you change your response? So again, we'll work with that a little bit more next week as well. So hang in there, everyone. Be well.
Thank you,
All right,
Don.
see you
Thank you,
then.
Donla. Thank
Okay.
you, Stella.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right,
Thank
be
you.
well.